Welcome to season 2 of the Girl Crush podcast with Donna Pesci. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Nadine Macaluso, famously portrayed by Margot Robbie in the movie The Wolf of Wallstreet. Today, Dr. Nae is a PhD and the author of the book Run Like Hell, A Therapist's Guide to Recognizing, Escaping, and Healing from Trauma Bonds. On this episode, Dr. Nadine talks about the behind the scenes of what it was really like to be married to the Wolf of Wall Street and what it was like to have her story made into a huge blockbuster Martin Scorsese film. We also talk about the transition from being in a traumatic relationship to becoming a therapist and helping others to escape traumatic relationships. We talk about narcissism, pathological lovers, divorce, and even Diddy. It was a great conversation, and I'm glad you're here for it. Here's my conversation with Dr. Nae. Hi, Dr. Nae. Thank you so much for joining the Girl Crush podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Thank you. So I want to talk about your work, and your book is really fascinating to me. And I have so much that I want to get to, but I want to start at the beginning. So your ex-husband is Jordan Belfort, who wrote and who everyone knows as The Wolf of Wall Street.
Correct.
So he wrote a book about his, and in turn your life, which was then made into a movie. He was played by Leonardo DiCaprio. You were played by Margot Robbie. I imagine that it was probably pretty wild to have a book and a movie come out about your life and not be the one to put it out there. So tell me about that experience and how you kind of found out that that was going to happen.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my ex-husband, he did write a book first. So he sent me the copy of it. And, of course, I read the first 10 pages and I think I was like, as my mother would call it, I had a mad Lucia moment. I called him up and yelled at him, and he was like, "No, I'm doing this for us." But I was already, happily married for many, many years. And I was like, "I don't think you're doing it for us." And, I was like, "Why would you write things that weren't true?" Right. And a lot of it is true, but some things he's like, "Well, it makes for a great book." And so I had my moments. I threw myself into bed, and then my husband came over and he's like, "Are you going to get up now?" So I got up and I was like, "Okay, that's the way I work." I give myself the space to have my feelings, and then I get on with my day. And then that was when I was going to get my master's and then my doctorate. And then it's going to be a movie. Right. And so at the time that it was, so I think, when did that? I'm just trying to get the exact time in my brain, but it was,
I think the movie came out in 2013.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think when he first started to talk about it was earlier than that, like 2007, 2008. And so I remember just thinking, this is totally surreal. But I had been in therapy and I did a lot of therapy around it, and actually did a lot of dream therapy. Ironically, that was the therapy I was going to back then. So I did a lot of therapy about it, and I gave myself again the space to have the feelings. But then I just said, "You know what, Nadine, this is bigger than you. And so you have to surrender into this." And so that's what I did. I surrendered.
Amazing. So I imagine it was pretty life-changing when the movie came out. How was that for you? Because I mean, I don't know, but did you have any idea that it was going to be this huge,
No.
I mean, Martin Scorsese directed, like, this is a crazy big movie. And I think it's almost like a cult classic today. People watch that movie over and over. And it really kind of took on a life of its own, because it wasn't just about his experience and your experience, but it was about, the financial industry. And I think that people kind of use it as like a study of, things that were going on at that time.
Yeah, correct. I mean, it just is a whole, very surreal experience, right? And I had no idea that it was going to be this big blockbuster. I mean, I just know I've had a lot of feelings about, like, my trauma being exploited, right, for the whole world for entertainment. But again, I dealt with that. And Paramount was nice enough to give us my current husband and I, a private screening. So I went to see it. So that was really nice. And I got to see it in private. And, I'm sitting down. I'm like, okay, this is so strange. Because, usually they make movies about you after you're dead, right? And so I looked at my husband, and after the movie, I said, okay, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
I looked like a young girl who loved him, who loved her children, and who was trying to deal with his craziness.
I mean, watching the movie, I don't think that you were portrayed poorly. I think the movie really, to me, you're the smart one. You're the kind of the one with the brain, and kind of the one that is really driving things, at least into a morally, more of a morally conscious. Trying to at least trying to, which I think is really interesting. So having Margot Robbie, who I think this was really kind of her breakout role. I think she was kind of, maybe, I don't want to say unknown, but she definitely wasn't the superstar that she is now. And this was a breakout role for her. I mean, it really kind of catapulted her career. So I imagine that that's pretty crazy. But did you get to meet her or talk to her about the role? You did. Okay, tell us about that.
They had called me, Martin Scorsese's office finally called me, and they said, we want to speak to you, blah, blah. And I think they also really want to see, because I didn't let them use my name. Because I didn't have creative input. I made no money. It wasn't my narrative. I was like, let me take one piece of control. You can't use my name. That's why they changed the name in the movie. And it was kind of silly because everybody knows it's me now anyway.
Right.
But I think they were calling really to see if I was going to sue them. Right. And I just said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, I really care about my kids. Really, that's who I'm focused on right now. And they said, would you meet her so she could get your accent? And I said, sure. And I was taking my daughter to college. And she was going back east because I was living in California at the time. And so I met with her, and they taped me to get this, ridiculous accent of mine. Everybody's been trying to tell me to get rid of my accent. So it was so ironic. Now they want it. And she was lovely. And she was just a sweet, young 22-year-old girl, just like I was, when I met Jordan.
Yeah. So did she talk to you about your life and kind of want to know that for her character, or was it mainly just trying to get there?
I talked a lot about my life when they taped me with the speech coach. So that was good. And then my husband and I took her to dinner, and she was talking a lot about how she didn't want to be naked in some scenes, but she was afraid to talk to Martin. And I said, well, that feeling right there, speaking truth to power and how much you fear it, that's what I felt my whole marriage. So if you can really embody that and think about that, then you'll get what I was feeling a lot of the time.
Wow, that's a really great kind of profound analogy that I wouldn't have thought of. But yeah, that really makes sense.
Honestly, I don't even know how I thought of it, but I guess it's just because that really was how I felt.
Yeah.
I had no voice, in my first marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you feel like them creating this movie without your creative input and not having a say so? I mean, did you feel kind of upset about that too, because they were kind of taking your story and making it about something that you...
Yeah, but the way I looked at it to change my mindset about that was that it was really Jordan's book. It was really his movie. It was his perspective. It was his narrative. And so once I released myself into that, I was like, okay, they didn't give a shit about my narrative.
Right. Right.
Which is par for the course with the way my marriage was. So it kind of all makes sense, right?
Absolutely. Do you think that there's anything? I mean, I think that the movie is. I mean, it was definitely a well-made movie. But now, knowing where you are and that you're a therapist and the things that you work on, which we're definitely going to get into, do you think that the movie did a good job at portraying the way your marriage was?
I do.
Okay.
I think they could have gone a little bit more into, but again, this was Jordan's narrative. Jordan and I actually fought a lot about his drug addiction. That was the main bulk of our fights. It wasn't really about women at all, actually. But that's the way he wanted to portray it. For whatever reasons, it worked. Maybe it made it more salacious, less painful to watch.
Sure, sure.
So, but really, we fought a lot more about his drug addiction.
So do you think that he, before writing this book, do you think part of it was him taking a little bit of the responsibility of, kind of what he put you through? Or do you think there was some other motive there? Because like I said, I don't feel like anybody comes away from this movie thinking poorly of you. I think that so it kind
I
of
think
seems
there
like
was a mix in there. I think like an indirect way to say, like, it wasn't you, because he portrays himself as the craziest person on the planet, aside from Diddy, okay, right? So, I mean, he actually seems quite normal now, but, so he portrayed himself very crazy. So I think that he's very bright, he's creative, he's intelligent, he felt the need. He always says it's a cautionary tale. So I want to honor that. That's how he sees it. And and maybe in an indirect way, he was saying, "Hey, I see you." Yeah, maybe.
yeah, that's interesting. So the movie ends, and your story kind of, or the story that you're living now, kind of
Yeah,
begins as that movie ends, right?
right.
So you get divorced, you have two kids,
Yes,
you get divorced and get out of this kind of crazy
crazy.
relationship that was well, you can say more about what it was than I can, but what happens then? You leave Jordan, you have two kids, and then what happens?
Yeah, so I left him, and I stayed in my house for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And I moved to California because I had met my current husband, and he lived in Los Angeles, and I wanted to get my children out of New York. I didn't want them to like go to school and have everybody whispering behind their back and have this legacy. And I didn't take any money.
Wow.
I always say I took my kids and my curtains, but I had a little business at the time. I had a maternity company, and I was in the garment business, and my current husband was in the garment business. So all the pieces kind of just fit together, and I moved and took everybody to LA.
Wow.
Do you
And
think
how
this
old?
was all behind me? It was all behind me.
How old were your kids at that
They
point?
were 3 and 5 when we
Oh,
got
so they were young.
separated. Yeah, so maybe they were young. They were young,
Okay.
6 and 4. Yeah, when we finally
Okay.
moved, maybe. Yeah, they were young. They were babies.
Wow. So you moved to LA and you have a company. How did that transition into your work as a therapist? How did you decide to become a therapist?
In the garment business, and I was selling clothing to like Target and Walmart and J.C. Penney and all these big chains, and you had to be so trendy and you had to be so on point with trends. And I was getting older, and I was like, you know what? I don't think this is going to last, right? I don't, even though I do love fashion, but I didn't want to have it my career anymore. And I started to meditate a lot. And like I say in LA, we meditate, drink green juice, and do yoga. So I was doing a lot of meditation. And it just came back to me to go back to school at 39 to become a therapist, because when I first met Jordan, I went into therapy. And I really believe that therapy and all that work that I had done on myself actually saved me. I don't know where I'd be today if I hadn't put myself into therapy back then. And so I just was like, you know what? I'm going to go be a therapist.
Wow. That just like that. And then you went back to school.
And then I'm the type of person, if I put my mind to it, I do it. And I went back to school, and it was just so fabulous. I love to write. I like to learn. I love psychology. I grew up in a very psychological home as a child. Those seeds were planted in me very young from my mother. And so when I was getting my master's, you have to do 3,000 hours to become a licensed therapist. So I was like, I might as well just stay in school while I'm doing the hours. And then I got my doctorate. And it was a magical time doing all that.
Wow. So did you have the intent when you went back to school to become a therapist? Did you have the intent to do the work that you're doing now, or did
No,
that just kind of happen?
I
Okay.
had no idea. Now, you would think it would have been obvious, but it wasn't. I just, I think through all my therapy work, I really have this belief of just being open and to seeing what emerges. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like not getting so pigeonholed into anything. And so actually I wanted to treat everybody. That was my mission. And I was actually stuck on that, which is ironic. But then as I opened my private practice and, the book had come out, like the movie was going to come out. So just, it was like a perfect storm of that. And then all these smart, bright, beautiful, kind women coming into therapy and trauma bonds.
Hmm.
It's like, how is this still happening in this world? Right. And then I think it was, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein. So there was all of this abuse of power. So it was like a mix of all of those three things. And then I said, okay, I'm going to write a book.
That's so interesting. So it does seem like it would be from an outsider's point of view, it seems like that's a natural progression, right? Like you went through
Yes.
this, you
Yes.
had personal experience and you were a survivor of it and you got yourself out. And
Yeah.
then you bring to the table also this educational background and clinical background from being a therapist. So it seems to the outsider that that was like just
Yeah.
kind of a
But
natural
I wish I
progression.
could say I had some nice grand plan that worked out. I had zero idea. And it just all came together honestly on its own in a way.
It's just the universe putting you in the right spot.
Yeah,
I feel like that happens
no,
sometimes.
I really do believe that
I do
because
too.
that's how it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. So you started seeing these women, which a lot of you speak about in the book, and I want to mention that I really liked that aspect of the book where, and I'm sure you're using different names, but you're using real people
Yes.
and real stories
Correct.
to kind of showcase the behaviors of these narcissistic pathological men. And it really, I feel like, makes it so relatable for people that are reading the book or listening to the book,
Yeah.
because when you're telling it in that setting, I just think it's like it's really relatable,
Yeah. Yeah.
to talk about it that way.
It was very important to me to use the stories to illuminate the clinical material because I was so aware that if I just go in and write, this is cognitive dissonance, this is a trauma, like it's going to fall dead on the page, right? And so I just knew the stories were so important because I knew they would validate the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's exactly what it does.
Yeah.
It's very successful at that, because when you're listening to these stories and the behaviors, both of the women and
Yes.
the men's behavior, but then also listening to how the women were dealing with, what they were doing kind of before they decided to go to therapy, I think is like, it's just so interesting. And it's made me, I have somebody in my life that was married for sure, who I always thought was a narcissist. And I think I want to get into this a little bit too, because there, narcissism is an actual clinical term.
Yes.
And, but some guys are just assholes, right? Like there's a difference between the two.
For sure.
So,
For
and I
sure.
think you do a good job of really talking about that. And also, I want to mention too, I like that you have on your website those tests that you
Yeah.
can kind of take and
Yes.
answer to see if you're in a,
Yes.
a relationship that, sounds dangerous or
Yes.
could be
Yes.
dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the book a little bit. The book is called Run Like Hell, A Therapist's Guide to Recognizing, Escaping, and Healing from Trauma Bonds. So first, tell me in your words what you're calling a trauma bond.
Yeah. So a trauma bond is at its simplest form, a toxic relationship between two emotionally attached people. So it can be between a parent and a child. It can be between a boss and an employee. But the way I write about it is it can be between friends, but the way I write about it is between intimate lovers. And so it has to have two conditions to exist. It has to have a power imbalance, right? Because in a trauma bond, the pathological lover wants power and control over their partner. So at the root of all trauma bonds is control. So there's usually a power imbalance. One person has the power. They get it through having more resources. They get it by being dominating and threatening because you fear them, or just the very fact that you love somebody. They have power over you, right? We just hope they're not going to exploit that love and trust. And then the second thing is intermittent reinforcement. And that's the behavioral pattern of the pathological lover, 70% of the time being cruel, controlling, unkind, betraying, but that 30% or 25%, they're kind and loving and generous and helpful. And so that behavioral pattern, which is very extreme usually, they're usually like extremely mean or extremely nice, that creates very extreme feelings inside the victim. And it actually is the bond in the trauma bond.
And so these relationships obviously don't start out that way.
Correct.
You know, people would never get into a relationship if it started out that way.
Exactly.
So how is it that men kind of get away with this sort of behavior? Are they just so used to it and they're practiced in the way that they enter a relationship that it kind of gives you a false sense of security before they turn it on?
Yeah, I think a lot of them, like I write about in the beginning, are charming and generous and helpful and kind, right? Even whether they're covert or overt about it, you know, if they're obvious or not so obvious, they have a mask of being a good guy, of being a guy that wants to love you, that wants to be your soulmate, that feels like they met their soulmate, right? You think you met a unicorn. But then over time, I call the mask Dirty John and Romeo. The Romeo mask slips and Dirty John starts to come. And you start to see these dominating, cruel, controlling, unkind behaviors. And now you're already in it though. And you're like,
Right.
wait, I thought that person loved me. Oh, then you must be having a bad day. Right? Then you start to make excuses or rationalize because we're social beings. We want to connect. We want to be in love.
Yeah. And that's what makes it so hard to get out of the relationship then, because you're kind of hooked, right?
Hooked. I say hope is the hook. You get hooked by hope.
Yeah. So there's another part of the book that you talk about women's personalities. There's traits in women's personalities that make them, I guess, more susceptible to being in these kinds of relationships. And when I was listening to the book, I was like, the things that you talk about, they're not bad qualities. They're actually good qualities in people. You talk about things like altruism and empathy and being conscientious and agreeable. So talk a little bit about what that means and how, you know, because I think that there's a lot of women that could see themselves as being some of those things. So how do you differentiate between, yes, I am some of those things, but no, I don't want to, you know, get caught up in a relationship like that?
So, you know, and it goes to the core of why I wrote my book. You know, we blame the victim forever. And I'm so done with that. And I really wanted to take the stigma off of the victim. That doesn't mean that we're perfect or that we don't have our part in certain things. But it's always, why does she stay? But not like, why does he do that? So in 2019, I read Sandra Brown's book, Women Who Love Psychopaths. And it really like cracked my mind open because she had been doing all this research on the five factor model of personality, which measures conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And so she gave these assessments to these women, and a lot of them weren't in the domestic violence shelters. They were judges, lawyers, doctors, stay-at-home mom, just not the typical woman that people had been researching. And so she discovered that a majority of the women scored very high in agreeableness and very high in conscientiousness, which hence I score very high in both. And so what happens is that, like you mentioned, these traits are really nice traits. I mean, if you and I are friends, I'm going to be loyal. I'm going to be tolerant. I'm going to be consistent, right? I'm altruistic, hence why I'm a therapist. And I'm conscientious. If I say I'm going to do something, I usually show up. I have follow through. I get it done. Again, albeit very imperfectly. But these are good qualities that get weaponized by the pathological person. And that's where it gets so tricky. Because if a woman comes to me and she's generous and kind and helpful and loving and loyal, now I might work with her to set boundaries more, but I'm certainly not going to pathologize her and tell her she needs to change it.
Right.
Right. So that's where the old model of domestic violence or trauma bonds was failing women.
Got it. So the other side of the coin is to look at the men and
Yes.
say, are there, and I agree with you, and I want to really kind of drive home that point that, this whole blaming the women and
Yes.
finding something wrong that the women did to get into that relationship or to let themselves be
Right.
abused or trauma bonded to this person. There's a lot of things that a lot of people and a lot of things that kind of point to the woman and say, well, why didn't she do this? And why didn't she do that? Instead of turning around and saying, well, why is this a relationship? Like, why is this man deciding to treat this woman like that? Right.
Correct.
So looking at it from, moving into a relationship, do you think that there are signs in the beginning that, women can look out for and say this, doesn't feel right? And I think you talked a little bit about too, there is a little bit of like your gut telling you like, this seems off, this seems not right. So tell me what you think about all
this
of
is
that.
where it gets tricky, right? Because remember, in the beginning, they're wearing the Romeo mask. So it's really hard to discern. You wouldn't think, if you're a trusting person, right? Why would you think that you're going on a date with a person that you can't trust? Because you're only seeing the world through your lens. So that's why it can be very tricky to catch the pathological lover. And if they're love bombing you and everything's going smashingly, but I do have a few things that women can look out for. Like if it feels too good to be true, it probably is. If it's going at intense warp speed and going super fast, that's a sign. What don't they want you to see? Right? If they're telling you that you're their soulmate after 2 weeks and they love you, that's a bit much unless you're 16.
Right.
So it is tricky, but these are things that and then over time you'll see words not matching actions. If you try to set a boundary and they don't let you, that's a sign. If you have an emotional need and they ignore it or dismiss it or say, oh, get over it, that's a sign.
Yeah. So talk about boundaries a little bit, because I think that's a really, it's an important thing in any relationship. And like you said, trauma bonds can be not only between a man and a woman, but also a parent and a child, an adult parent and a child, or friendships, or, anything. And I think it kind of seems like boundaries are important to everyone in every relationship. But can you talk a little bit about setting boundaries and what that should look like in a healthy relationship?
Yeah, I didn't really learn about boundaries till I was 31, till after I left Jordan. And I went to this place called the Karen Foundation where I went for a week to just really say, what the hell happened to me? After I left, I was like, I gotta get to the bottom of this because if I go through this again, I'm not gonna make it. And so that's where I really learned that I could say no, that no was a sentence, and that me having self-care and setting boundaries with people, like saying, I can't do that right now, or that doesn't seem right for me, or I won't compromise that value, was okay. It didn't mean that I would in a healthy attachment, you should be able to set boundaries and not lose it.
Right.
But in a trauma bond, when you try to set boundaries, forget it, World War III, because it's only about the pathological lover.
And so that is a really big sign then, if you can't set a boundary, or if they have
that I missed. Big, 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 big.
So if they have a big reaction to any sort of boundary that you're setting, That obviously is a
Run
writing
like hell.
specific. Run like hell.
Yeah, run like hell.
I love
They're
that.
doing that in the beginning. You think they're going to get better?
Right.
No.
Right. And then what happens is once that mask starts to fall, as you say, you continue to sort of see all of these new facets of this person's um, pathology and personality. Correct.
Correct.
So
Correct.
you have to kind of learn to either fix it or get out. And I don't necessarily want to say fix it, because you do talk about that as well in the book. I in my own experience with the person that I have that has a trauma bond or was in a marriage to a narcissist, there is a certain part of women, and I see this, probably you see it way more than I do, but the well, if I just love him enough, if I just show him, if I'm just as agreeable as possible, or if I can change him. The whole, like, I can change him thing.
Yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
that a lot with women
Oh,
and your
yeah. And I
patients?
believed it. I believed it. I believed that my love could change him. As grandiose as that sounds, right? That was a bit delusional on my part, but that's kind of what we've also been taught as women. That your prince is going to come and your loves are going to save each other. And so and since I love to love, I mean, it's one of my favorite things in the world to do. I really believed that if I was, if I did this a little better, if I didn't argue back, if I stayed quiet, then, all these things that you just mentioned, it would switch. But it wasn't about me. It was about him. I was not responsible for his drug addiction. I was not responsible for his abuse. But in the trauma bond, women, we blame ourselves because they blame us too, right? So they perpetuate that because, like, you made me do this. Don't tell me to stop doing drugs, right? And so they do blame us.
Um, and I think women must internalize that blame.
Correct.
And then they make it about themselves. So the distinction that you made is, it wasn't about me.
Right.
You could have done everything right. It was about him.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes. But I felt like I could have done something, but it was just a child's wish, honestly.
Yeah. And it's funny because, when we talk about this now, it feels like, well, it must be, really just like young women who maybe don't, they're not as mature, they don't have as much life experience to really see that. But that's not actually always the case, right? Because you talk about women in the book that have their own careers, have money, are smart and accomplished, and
Correct.
they still fall into these relationships.
Yeah, because these pathological people are good. I do think they know what they're doing and they know that it works. And so, and once you fall in love, you let your guard down. You start to trust, right? Or we blindly trust. We don't realize trust needs to be earned. And again, I just think as women, we've been so socially conditioned to be relational. And of course, I love relationships. I've made my whole life about it. But you, if you have to sacrifice and self-abandon repeatedly, it's not love.
Right.
And I think if you are successful, especially, you're like, I got this. I can fix this. I've done many things. I've accomplished a lot in my life, but you can't accomplish this.
That's actually a really good point, because if you are accomplished, you obviously got there from having some sort of drive and
Yes,
and
exactly.
not wanting to give up. And it seems like maybe that kind of works against you when you're in this type of relationship,
Yep.
because you don't want to fail.
That's right. That's a conscientiousness. And so, yeah, it's exactly right. And that's why I say it happens to anyone and everybody. Now, in my book, I break down if you're more dependent, if you've had developmental trauma yourself, or if you're more highly agreeable and conscientious, right? So I let women see the different personality traits that they could have, just so that your own. and you know what the pitfalls, and you know your strengths, and you know your weaknesses. And so we had like, we fix up the strength, the weaknesses, and we say, hey, you know what? Let's not lean into agreeableness when you're trying to get divorced.
Yeah.
Let's put that on the back burner and let's lean into conscientiousness, right?
Absolutely. So, what would you say to people that are reading your book and feeling like, hey, I might be in a trauma bond, I might be in a relationship with a pathological lover? What would be your first or second, or what would be
Yeah,
your
I mean,
advice
the
to
first
somebody?
thing is like, okay, the fact you have to have radical acceptance that this is where you're at, because they're so confused and they really rationalize and question themselves. Once you land on that, hey, you're in a toxic, dysfunctional trauma bond, that's the first step. You have to really accept that. And then you have to say, okay, what do I do? And I would say the first thing is to get educated, right? There's so much that's the one beautiful thing about social media now.
Yeah.
But really watch the sites that you get information from, make sure they're accredited, not just survivor turned experts, right? Which again, beautiful that people do that, but you just want to make sure that the people that you're listening to, even if you resonate with something somebody says, that when you go to really get help, that it's from a trauma informed person. And don't isolate. Reach out to people, let them know that you're going through this. And if you are married, my thing is you have to really not tell them you're going to leave them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because you can't let them see you coming. You have to do all the work. You have to wear the mask now. You have to do all the work behind the scenes, credit cards, bank accounts, documents, a therapist, a lawyer, whatever you need. If you're in domestic violence shelter, whatever they're doing to help you get prepared, then you say it. And you never say it when they're on drugs, right? You try to say it, in a public setting. So there are certain things that I talk about in my book, How to Leave Safely, because often when a woman wants to leave is the most dangerous time.
Because it's at the height of the
Yes.
things that are happening, right?
And also because you have to think about it. If this person only wants power and control over you, they're not going to be like, bye bye, have a great day. They're going
Yeah.
to be angered that they're
Right.
losing their control.
Right. Absolutely. So, a couple things I want to ask you about your own experience. I guess your situation was a little bit different because when you left, Jordan he went to jail at that point, right?
He got arrested. He didn't go to jail. He didn't get
Okay.
sentenced until years later, but he got arrested. Yeah.
Okay. At that point, what was was there a final straw, or was it
Oh,
just
yes, many. There
okay?
were so many. For me, there were so many, but the first one was, as we depict in the movie, as we see in the movie, when he got violent with me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little different than how it was in the movie, but it was when I actually said to him, I'm not going to sit here and watch you kill yourself. So you have to get intervention or I'm leaving you. You have to go to rehab. So that was the first one. The second one was when I explained to him, I was like, it was so hard with the drug addiction, with the abuse. And I wanted some remorse or empathy. And he was like, it wasn't that bad. And I was devastated. And I didn't know
Wow.
the word callousness back then. But then my heart closed. It was so weird. I can picture myself in the sushi restaurant when he said it to me. And that's a long time ago, right? That's like 26 years ago. But I can picture it because that was it. And then I was done. I think the lack of remorse was almost worse than what happened in some ways. And then once he got arrested, I was like, okay, now the power imbalance has shifted. We're equals.
Wow.
He doesn't have power over me and I'm safe and I can leave. So I always say to my patients, like, you're not always lucky that your partner gets arrested.
Right. Most don't, I'm sure, at that point.
Most don't.
What do you think? Do you ever think back and wonder what would have happened if he didn't get arrested?
I don't really, but it's a great question. I don't know.
You
I mean,
said your heart closed. And so,
yeah, so I was done with him. So I
yeah.
think we would have eventually gotten, I think we would have eventually gotten divorced, but I don't know how it would have went down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to ask is you are in, you've been married, remarried for a very long time now,
8
correct?
years. Yeah.
Wow. And so obviously, you have a good, healthy marriage. What do you think? Is there anything that you kind of learned in that? Obviously you learned things that to stay away from, but like, did you learn things from that marriage, and how did having that first uh trauma or that first relationship help you to then find someone that was, truly a good person, and was and get you into like a healthy relationship?
Yeah, like I said, I had gone to this, I'd been in therapy, I'd gone to this place called the Karen Foundation. So I really looked for, did this person respect my boundaries? And they did. And when I had a conversation with them, like our first disagreement, and which happens, right? No matter what. And he was like, okay, yeah, I get that. And I was like, what? You get it? No, this is nuts. And I was so shocked that somebody understood and didn't fight back and try to demean me or beat me down into submission. And so I was like, okay, maybe this could work.
Wow, it's something as simple as that, which should be
It's so
normal.
simple. And because now I say, if somebody can't hear you, they can't love you.
That's a really good statement. That's so true.
So simple, so profound. But you have to be able to hear people and listen to them and understand them and not be
Yeah,
defensive and like to look at it from their perspective. If you want to be
absolutely.
in a relationship, if
Right,
you don't, just, keep being a jerk.
right, right. So I had somebody ask about co-parenting with
Yeah.
a narcissist and someone that you are in a trauma bond with. What is your advice for that? Or what would you say to somebody that is still trying to co-parent and be in that relationship? Because I can tell you that the the person who's close to me is doing that now.
Yeah.
And it still feels very much as though she's still in the relationship, because
Yeah.
she still has to have that contact with this person. And regardless of how, um, the contact maybe isn't daily, and the contact isn't, for long, long periods of time, but he still finds a way
I know.
to kind of torture her.
Yeah.
He still finds a way to say mean things, put her down, make her feel bad about herself. And it's not just that person. I know, friends of mine that have
Oh,
gotten
yeah.
divorced and have had, relationships where
I
they've
know.
done the right thing, they've gotten out of the relationship, but now because they have children, they're still kind of in it.
I know. And that's really challenging. Ironically, Jordan and I are very good. We're very good co-parents. I don't
That's
know if it's
great.
because the power imbalance shifted. Um, we just were. That doesn't mean we didn't have our issues around it, but we were able to be decent with each other. I have to say that. So, but I know that that's really most likely not the case quite often. And so what I say to women that have to deal with that is, you have to be aware of your attachment pattern, of your personality traits. You have to know yourself so well to really work towards not getting triggered by this person, right? Because I have a saying, he doesn't live in your house anymore. Don't let him live in your head. And like, you have to expect that they are still going to be the way that they are. But what you do have control over is how you respond to them. And that doesn't make it easy, but having a good therapist, having sometimes even a divorce coach, aside from a divorce attorney, having good friends to talk to, journaling about it. And there's a term called gray rocking that a lot of people talk about, where you have to learn to stay very neutral in front of them no matter what they do. And the way I'd say to my women, I'm like, don't please them, don't rebel, keep coming from your authenticity. And that's really all you can do.
That's
You
great
can't
advice.
you can't get into a struggle with them. You might
Yeah,
as well have stayed married.
right. Right. That's really great advice
I
because
know it's hard.
yeah, it is, I'm sure.
And
And
try to avoid the court system at all if you can, because that's terribly traumatizing.
I bet that is really great advice. So I want to talk a little bit. You have great social media. You are always on there, kind of, talking about things in short form that you really get into in long form in the book. And I think I love that. So I just want to compliment you on that because I think it's really great. So I think anybody who's listening that has any of these thoughts should definitely follow you for some great information, and of course buy the book. But you did something yesterday where you read a passage from I think Kim Porter's
Important. Yeah.
book, and with everything that's going on with Diddy right now, I think it's such a great I guess example of the kind of things that we're talking. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what you did on social media with
So,
that?
so Kim Porter wrote a book. Supposedly, it's her diary, right? And it got released, I think September 26th. Think. And so I bought it immediately. And when I read it, I was floored. It just had all the patterns of the trauma bonding. And ironically, the next day it was taken down because all the powers that be didn't want people reading it. But I spent about 12 hours like a maniac reading it and then breaking it down into chunks to explain what a trauma bond is and using her voice because I really wanted to honor her voice. And I've gotten, a lot of great comments, but I've gotten some people like, well, the book isn't real, blah, 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 blah. And I said, you know what? How many women have diaries that people don't know about? A lot.
Right.
Right. And maybe it's not her exact words, but I do believe it's what she endured. And then finally, I say, I think Cassie taught us, and I'm going to cry when I say this. Okay. This is a moment that we have to start to believe victims. Like
Yeah.
I'm just done with people not like 3,000 people came forward 2 days ago. And so I just really wanted to honor Kim's story, her voice, and use this profound Greek tragedy to demonstrate what a trauma bond is and all the facets of it.
Yeah. Well, I think it was really powerful, a really powerful thing that you did.
Thank
And I think a lot's going to be coming out, obviously, about,
you.
that whole story, which is crazy because I feel like we are getting more and more of that
We are.
nowadays. And, these things are coming out, whereas I don't think that they're just starting to happen. I think that people before they were just able to
Hide it all.
hide it, and now things like that are really coming out.
Mm.
Do you think what do you think the shift is? I mean, I don't know if you have an opinion on that, but do you think that the shift is that the women are getting stronger and being able to come
Oh, I,
forward?
I think the more we see victims come forward and state their truth, right, it just feeds the rest of the women. That's why the Me Too movement was so powerful. And I think we saw it started with Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, right? The Boy Scout leaders, even the priests, unfortunately. I mean, we were seeing so much abuse of power. And I think people have had it, and I think we're just in like this collective unconscious right now where there's this big shift to illuminate and expose this very dark side of life. And again, I just happen to be a part of it,
Yeah,
right? I'm part of this shift and I'm very proud of it because it needs to stop. You
absolutely. And
it
yeah,
needs to stop. It's horrible. I mean, listen, we're all imperfect human beings, but you know what's going on with all of this abuse of power and the sex trafficking and rape, because we can't say the other word, and
hmm,
it's atrocious.
yeah, absolutely. I love getting your perspective on this type of thing. I love following you on social media, like I said. So,
Thank you
and
so
I
much.
think,
I really appreciate.
yeah, absolutely. Your book is some really powerful stories in it, and like I said, it's very relatable. You make it, you take this kind of clinical stuff and you make it very digestible and relatable for women. So I want to say thanks for doing that. And before I let you go, I want to talk, because we do talk about women's journeys on this podcast, and I want to just switch gears a little bit and ask you about writing a book. I think it's, the subject matter of the book is amazing, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it. But I want to talk about the accomplishment of, and not just the accomplishment, but sitting down to decide, like, I have something to say. I want to put it, I want to put pen to paper and get it out there. What was that experience like for you?
Oh God, it was a very experience. I don't know that I'm running to do it again, but it was very challenging, very arduous, but now very rewarding. But I don't know really. I think because there was this movie, I just was like, I have something to say about it, but it's very different, right, than Jordan's perspective. So, and it just gave me a platform. Like I couldn't have asked for a better thing if I asked for it, and I just was like, okay, I'm seeing this. I have this platform to use. And I just was like, I want to take all of the research from the ivory tower and bring it to to women, that they can have better, more meaningful lives. But it was, woo, baby. I don't know if we're doing that anytime soon. It was tough. It was tough.
I bet it would be. Well, I love when someone takes something that was so negative in their life and doesn't just walk away from it, but turns it into something that can help others. And I think that that's what you really decided to do by deciding to become a therapist, and then by going through this step of writing the book. So thank you for that.
Thank
I
you
think
so
that's
much for your
amazing.
kind words. Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
sometimes for the sake of it, sometimes I can forget that because it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So this month I'm like going crazy because I just want to get the message out there and just help women / people everywhere.
Absolutely. And I do want to say just slash people, because like we said
Of
in the
course,
beginning, it could
it's
be, it could be anybody. It doesn't have to be romantic relationships that are affected. So thank you so much for that. So I do want to say to everybody, the book, I'm going to say it again. It's called Run Like Hell, A Therapist's Guide to Recognizing, Escaping, and Healing from Trauma Bonds. And I do think that everybody should check out your website too, because I think you put a lot of great information on there. And that's Dr Nae, NAE.com. And of course, follow you on social media, because you're informative on social media, but also entertaining, and you do some funny things. And, you definitely relate back to the movie sometimes and talk about, like, is this real? What was in the movie? Did this really happen? I
a little fun with it too.
Yeah, it's so fun. And I think it's really, I think people really enjoy that too. So thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Girl Crush podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information on this episode and my guest. If you're enjoying this podcast, please hit the subscribe button. You can also leave me a comment about the episode. I create this show for you, and I would love to hear your feedback. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for more information on upcoming topics, guests, and some other fun content. Thanks again for being here.